Welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, and this video we're breaking down Dune. We are travelling back to Arrakis to work through the trilogy and top things off with Dune Messiah. I've just reread the book by Frank Herbert and can't wait to talk about the things in the movie. The book itself is regarded as one of the best sci-fi novels ever written, and its influence on the genre is completely unmeasurable. Be it Star Wars, The Chronicles of Riddick, Stargate or Alien, it's difficult to imagine something sci-fi without thinking of this book. Now because of this, the film rights were a hot property, and right from the off, people saw the potential. Arthur P. Jacobs quickly locked down the rights, and this gave him under just a decade to make a movie. Unfortunately, he passed away in 1973, and 74 saw them being bought by Jean-Paul Gibbon. He brought in Alejandro Jodorowsky to direct, and he ended up hiring H.R. Giger. Some of his designs are outlined in this book, and though the project failed, a lot of this stuff then made it to Alien. Jodorowsky wanted to make this one of the biggest films ever though, and took some massive swings when it came to the casting. Salvador Dali was going to be the Emperor, with Orson Welles then playing Baron Harkonnen. Paul Atreides would be played by his son Brontis, and Mick Jagger was going to play Fade. You also had Pink Floyd on board to craft the music for the movie, with Hans Zimmer actually referencing this in Dune. During the first trailer for Part 1, he actually used the song Eclipse as the backing track, which was a nice little nod to their inclusion. Although they came up with some incredible plans, in execution, things were a lot more difficult. Dune is one of those books that was said to be impossible to adapt, and even Denny couldn't capture it across two of his films. And they're both nearly 3 hours long each. Jodorowsky didn't fare much better either, and his was thought to be about 14 hours long. So the project never really got going, and by 1977, we of course saw Star Wars. Amongst the film community though, it is theorized that if they got Dune out first, then movies today would look completely different. Dune could have changed the landscape of sci-fi, but Lucas of course beat them to the punch. However, the rights were still so hot and everyone wanted them. You see, if a film like Star Wars that borrowed things from Dune could be the biggest film of all time, then surely the original could do even better. I think what Lucas really got right though is the sense of humour that Dune doesn't really have at all. Star Wars was always aimed more at being a fun Buck Rogers thing, whereas Dune's much more darker and dour. So personally, I think even if they swapped the order, Star Wars probably would have appealed to the masses much more than Dune. And yes, I am saying this as someone who classes this as their favourite book of all time. But people were putting plans within plans within plans together, and by 1978 they had a screenplay. Frank Herbert even turned in a script treatment which was going to come in at roughly 3 hours. This is when Ridley Scott was hired by H.R. Giger, who came to craft the designs. Now this is something we touched upon in our Alien breakdown, and a lot of the stuff he designed for this eventually got brought across to that. But yeah, they weren't exactly making action figures for kids like Star Wars was. Or maybe they were, because I do own quite a lot of Alien figures as well. But the point is that adapting this was a massive struggle, and Scott moved on to Alien and then ended up shifting to Blade Runner. The rights were then renegotiated, with Dino De Laurentiis buying them back. Now around the time, there were rumblings that David Lynch had been offered to direct Return of the Jedi, and thus they offered him this as well. Dune was just more up his street, having made his name on Elephant Man and Eraserhead. And yeah, when you look at his version of Dune, there is a lot of Lynch there. Originally though, his version was running at over 4 hours, and thus he was forced to cut it down. That's something that I describe as a hatchet job, and though a longer version was released for TV and physical media, it didn't really bring his full vision to life. But if you want to see as close as you're going to get to what his vision was, then we have teamed up with Arrow Video, who have launched this 4K. Not a massive important ad here, but if you go to their site and use the code HEAVYSPOILERS, you will get 10% off that. Anyway, Lynch said that Dune was a bit of a sore point for him, and that he had zero interest in what Villeneuve was doing. Now call me shit, yeah? Don't get your knickers in a twist, yeah? That's not because he hates him or anything along those lines, but he said, all it's gonna do is bring back painful memories. Like watching your ex-girlfriend happy with her new man or something, you just better off ignoring it. He said his Dune did make him feel like a failure, and overall, it wasn't what he wanted to make. Lynch was of course never given the final cut, was forced to condense major parts of the script, and voiceover was brought in to try and explain all the big plot holes. It's clear that Lynch didn't really have much say, and he was actually in the middle of working on a second script as they had plans to make 2 sequels. However, once his movie bombed, it was kicked to the curb, and basically forced out of there faster than the Atreides. Now obviously the characters have a lot on their plate, and being in a situation where you're constantly on edge can be very, very draining. Just kind of leaves you in a slump. I'm sure we've all felt pulled down by the world at some point, or anxious that we just have way too much to do. I've definitely felt like that myself, and haven't really talked about this much on the channel, but back in 2019 I got diagnosed with anxiety, which made a lot of things about my life that suddenly make sense. I'd always been worried about things and used to panic if something went off schedule, or I was late for something, or behind on my work. Just talking about it though has really helped me deal with it without medication, and mentally I'm way less stressed now. So I've teamed up with BetterHelp, who are the paid partner of today's video, to bring you this brilliant deal with their online therapy sessions. Now regardless if you have a clinical mental health issue like depression or anxiety, or you just have some things that you need to unpack, therapy can give you the tools to approach your life in a very different way. BetterHelp easily helps you find a therapist, and it can match you with a therapist quickly. Working online through an app, it allows sessions to be remote and means that you can balance it around your life. Signing up is easy as well, and you can get matched with a therapist in just a couple of days. They also easily allow you to change your therapist if you don't feel like things are working out, so you can find the perfect one that's the right fit for you. At no additional cost, you can swap your therapist as well and go with someone else if you feel like you've gained all you can. If you've ever been curious about taking therapy in general, or have used it in the past, then this is the perfect opportunity to pick it up and see if it can change your life. Again, just go to betterhelp.com/heavyspoilers and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That's betterhelp.com/heavyspoilers for 10% off. Huge thank you to BetterHelp for supporting this channel as well, and thanks to everyone who checks out the deal. Cheers. Now we then got the sci-fi miniseries in the year 2000, which actually isn't too bad if you want to learn the lore. Unfortunately though, it didn't have a blockbuster budget, but that and all its sequels should get you filled in on the story. Shortly after that, we then had Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potter films, both of which managed to adapt expansive works. This made Paramount think they could finally make Dune, and in 2008 they brought on Peter Berg. This fell apart though, but in 2011 Legendary bought it, which leads us to where we are today. Villeneuve was hired in 2016, and he's gone on record saying how much of a fan he is. Then he said he loved Lynch's film growing up and followed all the making of stuff when he was a kid. Apparently he used to obsess over hearing about it in the Fantastic Film magazines and read through the novel at just 12 years old. According to IMDb trivia, he actually held off jumping on the film as he wanted to direct some sci-fi movies first to get experience in the genre. At the time he was known for Prisoners, Enemy and Sicario, but held off on doing this until Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. Though the director had a lot of critically acclaimed films before this, I think this film and its sequel especially are what cemented him as the second coming of Nolan. I have to admit as well that I really struggled with his adaptation the first time I saw it, and this was to the point that I even had to make a video about how wrong I was in my initial review. Since then, it's a film I've completely grown to love, and every time I watch it, I think I appreciate it more. But that takes us into the movie itself, which, like a lot of other creators, has split the book in two. However, Legendary knew Dune was a risk, and thus they didn't want to film things back to back. The sequel was optioned, but it did depend on the performance of this film, but as we know, that has been made, thankfully, and Messiah's there as well. However, it did mean that some things had to be exercised, including characters like Fade, who aren't present in this first film. This was because they didn't want to waste time on things that would distract from the story here, especially if we didn't get a payoff. Now, the film is quite unorthodox in its opening, and we actually start things before we get the logos. This is some Sardaukar throat singing, with it later being repeated when we get to their planet.
3 battalions. As agreed.
Now, there's a lot of potential ways to take this quote, with Paul's dreams being laced throughout the movie. All of these help to hint what's going to come, and in many ways, they hold symbolic meanings. In some he sees Chani, and in others he sees Jamis, showing that the timelines and predictions are slightly off. Throughout the film, Paul constantly dreams of his death, but why is this something that happens when it doesn't happen at all? Well, the way I take it is that Paul's witnessing his death, or rather, the symbolic death of the man he used to be. In every person Paul kills, a part of himself dies. Jamis is the first life he takes, and come the end of the jihad, he'll be a shell of who he was. Jamis being the first blood he spills is also a change from the book, and in that he kicks one of the Harkonnen pilots in the desert so hard that it kills him. However, I think skipping that and saving it for Jamis gives the final battle much more weight. This is what finally kills who Paul was and makes him become someone new.
All Atreides must die. For
This is why we also get that line about how Paul Atreides must die in order for the Kwisatz Haderach to rise. Jameson One's also seen as a teacher, which may symbolize his death, showing a way that he can become the Fremen's leader. There's even better theories that this is Leto II looking back on the history of his family. In case you don't know, he's a gigantic sand god that lived for thousands and thousands of years, and this came after melding with sandworms and taking loads of spice. But he's able to tap into his ancestral memories, which is something spice allows. Spice can grant you the ability to see both the past and future, with one being able to tap into their family's genetic memory. Now this is built upon the idea that our own DNA can affect our personality, with us being guided by the ancestry that shaped us. So potentially Leto is the worm god looking back at this and recounting the events that led to his creation. Either way, it's just a great way to grab your attention, with this popping up before the movie begins. The quote also doesn't appear in the book either, so yeah, again, maybe that's why. But dreams, of course, also have a double meaning, as dreams can often mean one's goals. Paul dreams to be someone that could bring peace, but in order to do this, he has to create a war. This in the end will make him lose himself, and it's the cost that it takes to be the boss.
When you take a life, you take your own.
I think Villeneuve was also very smart to start it this way, as Dune's pretty complex when you get into it. It tackles languages, religions, prophecies, false prophets, different houses, treachery, the rise and fall of empires, technology, and also politics. It leads to a wealth of different things to tackle that makes this such an expansive universe. However, because of this, there's also a lot of things that people have failed to adapt. One major criticism about David Lynch's version is that the cut-down film was pretty incoherent due to all the spinning plates. So Denny stripped the film down to its most basic points and created a coming-of-age story about a son taking the place of his father. Now, one of the big differences in Dune compared to other sci-fi novels is that it didn't necessarily focus all on technology. Dune is clearly inspired by Lawrence of Arabia, and a lot of it's about people living in the desert. The novel was released in a time where lots of sci-fi stories had lasers, robots, and vast journeys through space, and while that's present in Dune, it's all kind of there in the background instead of being at the forefront. Herbert actually sets things in a universe where we've already achieved a lot of technological advances, but in doing so, we also lost our humanity. In the Duneverse, AI was actually created, and humanity ended up relying on it to do pretty much all of their thinking. Unfortunately, you'll often see it today as well, where people have just simply forgotten how to think. Instead of using their brain, they'll simply ask a machine rather than trying to work things out. It's a lot easier to just get answers instantly from something else, but in many ways, it also completely limits you. For example, maths exams. I remember doing them, and you had to do all the working out in your head. You had to actually think about how to work things out, but now we've got calculators. AI can do it as well, and I can't actually remember the last time I sat down and worked through a maths problem. If you apply that to everything, including an entire species, then slowly mankind will be held in place. Eventually the machines took over, and naturally they started to oppress us. This led to a war between AI and humanity, which was known as the Butlerian Jihad. Dune Prophecy did actually touch upon this, though it did take place in the aftermath. But there's a world where machines are feared and outlawed. It's something that's big enough for its own video, but during this time, the people behind the machines also had the power to enslave others. Mankind did eventually beat them out, but there was a law put in place where it was illegal to create thinking machines. Humanity still needed to expand its horizons though, and thus people turned to this mind-altering drug. That is, spice, and the perception-altering substance opened up our consciousness and allowed our minds to go to the next step. This is where we see things like the Mentats, who are able to carry out computer-like calculations in their heads. Normally, a Mentat starts taking spice as a child, and this allows them to gain a position in a house. This will normally be somewhere where they can provide counsel, and thus it's a very coveted position. Houses themselves control the planets, and to be in their good graces is what people aspire to. The houses themselves are very difficult to infiltrate, and you can get into one in either one of two ways. 1. You can be born to it through bloodline. 2. You can be assigned to them through something like the Bene Gesserit, or earn your place through skill and knowledge, or marry into it and become a family member. But yeah, very, very difficult to get into, and these houses all originate from Earth, with the Atreides beginning their life in Greece. The name Atreides plays off the name King Atreus, who was a prominent figure in ancient Greece. The Atreides themselves come from a long line of matadors, and metaphorically this symbolizes the family. Fighting a bull was a labor of Hercules, and we also had the myth about the bull-headed Minotaur. So fighting bulls is just something that's gone throughout the family, and they're very much people who go toe to toe with something much more powerful than they are. That pretty much acts as a metaphor for the movie and sums up their rivalry with the Harkonnens. The Harkonnens themselves also represent the bull as they blindly charge in without thinking things through. This eventually leads to the Baron's rune, and it completely destroys his house. Throughout the film, we constantly see a model of a matador and a bull, and the cloth itself represents Arrakis. Both sides are desperate to keep a hold of this, and according to the wiki, the bullfighting sculpture we see was created in order to enforce this double meaning. There's also bull models and icons laid throughout the film, and on the grave that the Duke visits at 13 minutes, we can catch a bull in Matador. This is the grave of Paul's granddad Paulus, who died during a bullfight. In the expanded lore, we know this bull was poisoned by his wife, and this is what sent it into a rage. Now I know a lot of people don't consider that canon, however, the idea of treachery by someone close to you is something the family face in the film, so yeah, I've always liked that connection. We can also catch Grecian letters along the bottom of the grave, tying back to their origins on Earth. In many ways, this idea, the lineage, and the constant idea of fighting bulls, that impacts how the Duke approaches things with the Harkonnens.
Grandfather fought bulls for sport. Yes. Look where that got him.
Still though, he heads into battle with the bull, and ultimately he loses his life in the face of the Harkonnens. Now kinda looping back around to spice, but this is the most valuable substance in the galaxy beyond it just expanding your mind. The substance also allows for interstellar travel, and thus if you control this, you control absolutely everything. Think about it, if the Emperor can't fly or leave his planet, then he's completely screwed, and beyond that, all the goods in commerce are as well. There's no importing, exporting, places can't go to war and conquer, they also can't expand their infrastructure, money, politics, and basically everything relies on spice. It would be like getting rid of electricity. So everything is based around this, and thus he who controls spice controls everything in the universe. Now, the side effects of spice are that it's very, very addictive, and if you ingest too much, then it makes your eyes go blue. Taking too much can expand your mind past the point of having a sense of place as well, and it can also cause someone to mutate. It takes a vast amount in order for that to happen though, but the Spacing Guild leaders are still something a bit beyond human. They're the ones who navigate space, and they do this by using spice to expand their minds and show them how to travel. They've often been depicted as people who look like fish, and metaphorically, they explore the stars like how the pioneers explored the ocean. We begin the movie itself with spice rolling over the dunes, with this appearing a lot like an ocean. In Dune Part 2 especially, Denny talked about how he shot the sand to resemble waves. This is why the worms move almost like fish, and it plays into that idea of an ocean. The spice glistens and sparkles in the wind, and it creates the idea it's a valuable substance like gold. This makes the entire planet like a crown jewel or diamond, which everyone in the universe is after. This has of course led to conflict, and we hear Chani describing the war against the Harkonnens. Who we see first though is the character Jamis. Paul must kill him in order to become their leader, and he's also framed in front of Chani. Paul kills him and then goes to her, and it's a nice way to set up his journey. The Harkonnens are also framed as an opposite side to them, and we learn they've amassed a fortune dealing in spice. Built on the bloodshed of the Fremen, it's said they're richer than the Emperor himself. Now in this opening, we meet the Beast, who's played by none other than Dave Bautista. Bautista starred in Denny's Blade Runner 2049, and the director was one of the first people who really took him serious as an actor. In the David Lynch film, the Harkonnens also all had red hair, whereas here Villeneuve makes them completely bald. Their pale pasty look evokes royalty of old, and in medieval times it tended to show privilege. This is why Elizabethans used to cake themselves in white makeup, because people who worked jobs in the sun often got a tan from it. Now Villeneuve wanted the Harkonnens to seem like this because it reflected the planet they were from. It's a colourless world with no natural light, completely bleak and lit by a black sun. On the other side of this, Arrakis is bright and vibrant, with there being a constant feeling of heat. But the Harkonnens are the ones with the power, which we see from their countless ships and technology. However, the Fremen are rising up against them, which we see symbolically when a fighter rises out the sand. Now we discover that though the Harkonnens were winning, the Emperor forced them to pull back, and herein lies the plot. The Harkonnens simply have too much power. They're richer than he is, and potentially could overthrow him. We learn that the Harkonnens have their eyes on the throne as well, and if they held Arrakis, that might be possible. On the flip side of this, the Atreides are more popular than the Emperor, and this was down to their kind and polite nature, where they always hit the thumbs up. So he kinda wants them to take out each other. Though the Harkonnens win, it costs them a fortune, and it will take years to earn back the money. So that will buy the Emperor time, and this whole film's a plot to weaken his rivals.
He sets the stage for a war. which would weaken both houses.
Now, we then jump from a war in the desert to a planet surrounded by oceans. We can tell that rain's even running down the window as Paul sleeps, and it's such a great way to contrast the environments. This is Caladan, and we then get a flash of the air in the bottom right. It's important to note as well that this is not AD, as in the Dune universe, they use the measure of AG. This denotes the year that the Spacing Guild was formed and the group created space travel. Thus, it's difficult to guess exactly when this is, but it has been estimated we're at 23,000 AD. The book says that the Universal Standard Calendar is 20 hours shorter than an Earth year, and they also don't mention leap years. But yeah, people have sat down who are much smarter than me, they've worked that out, and they say that that's when the movie takes place. But in the book, Caladan's described as being a paradise, and they say there was no need to build one as they already had it. Ultimately though, this means that the families become soft by living there, and thus they're prey for the Harkonnens. Caladan's a place that has nothing but water but no spice, whereas Arrakis has water but spice is abundant. So it just works really well as a place to start off at. The wide shot of the planet also shows us a mountain with a crack in the middle. Now, I think this is Mount Sayubi, which is mentioned in the book as being one of the landmarks. This hangs over the castle, and I believe we see it later on in one of the wide shots. Going to breakfast, we then meet Paul's mother, Lady Jessica. She's a concubine to Duke Leto, but throughout the work, he constantly remarks how his biggest regrets that he didn't marry her. Jessica, as we learn, is one of the Bene Gesserit, and they're a group of nasty women. Now, they're basically an order of women that are a secret sect that rule through power and influence. Though the Emperor and House leaders are propped up as the leaders, they always turn to the Bene for counsel. The universe is ruled by men, but because they're the ones giving the orders, they're sort of a hidden hand guiding the universe that controls almost everything. Like they have investments in absolutely everything. This includes planting the Kwisatz Haderach, which will be a supreme being that they themselves can control. They've manufactured an entire religion that speaks about his coming, and this is also that when he arrives, they can rule the universe through controlling him. Now, going back to those Greek metaphors, it's clear that their council's influenced by many things. The Books and Nachos podcast pointed out that they're a bit like the Sister of Fates, who in themselves would go on to influence the norms. These characters also clearly influenced Star Wars as well, with them being a basis for the Sisters of Dathomir. The name itself is based on the Catholic Order Jesuit, and Frank Herbert's son Brian actually confirmed this was indeed the case. The Sisterhood can do things like the Voice as well, which would later influence Jedi mind tricks. The Jesuit are trained to have complete control of their body, and this is even down to a cellular level. This means they can counteract poisons and survive things like the Water of Life. Because of their ability to manipulate cells, they can also control the gender of their child. Sometimes the Bene will even choose the hottest woman they can find, train them up, and basically send them in to advise an emperor or house head, and obviously the guy's gonna get swayed. They can then take his sperm, have a child, so they've got the bloodline, and so on and so forth. They can also match and help guide houses towards marrying other houses, so all the rulers across every universe, they basically pick and choose. This is also they can create that Kwisatz Haderach, who is someone who'll be seen as the Messiah. But he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. But yeah, things are kind of coming to a head, and they figured out that within one generation or the next, they're gonna have that child. Now the plan originally was to have Jessica bear a daughter, and this would then marry into the Harkonnens. This would unite these two feuding families, and their child would potentially be the Kwisatz Haderach. Their child was then going to sit on the throne, and along with this, they'd come with all the abilities that you would normally get from Spice. They could travel through space, do the Mentat stuff and subscribe, do the stuff with the Voice, and basically control everyone throughout the universe. However, Jessica decided to have a boy, and this is because the Duke wanted one, and she wanted to please him. So since then, they have been like, oh, the plan's a bit fucked up, but the kid's still alive, let's keep an eye on him. Now Herbert also recognised the power of religion, which is something the Gesserit use as a weapon. They realise that if people believe en masse that a man's a messiah, they'll follow him on a path that they decide. Superstition and religion are used as a way to control, and thus this figure will let them control the universe. He'll be the most powerful being that's ever existed, and will sit in the palm of their hand. However, the curveball by Jessica has really thrown them off, and thus this is why in the opening they're here to test Paul. This test can see whether someone is an animal, which is how the Gesserit view most of the population. They think that animals won't be able to control themselves and will act instinctively to get away from danger. Thus, only someone with a brain can think of a situation, assess it, and hold their hand in place and deal with the pain. Whether Paul's a messiah or whether he's a false prophet, though, is something that the story does kind of grapple with, and throughout the films, we're going to question whether he's been pushed on this path or whether he's actually fulfilling a prophecy. Now, we see right from the off that Paul's life is all about training. Even at breakfast, he's told to do the voice, and this is then followed by sparring. It's also important to notice that Paul asks for water, which in itself will become a valuable commodity. We then cut to him studying the Fremen and a still suit, which when he gets a vision of the people. Still suits are actually crafted to absorb water from the body, and they recycle it so they can take it in more than once. So poop is basically getting liquefied in this right now, and then taken back into my body. I shit you not. They're not exactly the best clothes out there. You can't see, but I've got loads of lights around me. It's the middle of summer. I'm fucking boiling. And I really wish that I had a nice t-shirt on now instead. Why don't you get one, Paul? Well, I will, mate, and if you want to check out our merch store right below the video, we've got our Lisan Al Gayoub Dune Spice Baller shirt. That's available at the merch store below, along with lots of other film and movie inspired stuff, and there's also big discounts running through the summer. It all helps videos like this get made, and thank you very much if you picked one up. I really appreciate it. Now, from this point, we see as the Emperor's messenger arrives, and we see people with giant helmets as well. Due to the orange masks and blue eyes poking out from beneath, people have suspected that these might be the Spacing Guild. I'm not sure if that's the case, but we do see Jessica in a blue dress. The circles on it are actually the Bene Gesserit seal, showing where her true allegiances lie. The Mentat Sophia Howard also gives the cost of the journey.
3 guild navigators, a total of 1.46 million, 62 Solaris round trip.
This shows not only how wealthy the Emperor is, but it also adds to the pressure that the Duke must accept. This could easily have been an email, but the Emperor's gone above and beyond to add to the pressure. Like the guy's got a giant scroll. The Duke accepts and he then looks at his son, which is where you might notice a golden thing on his neck. This is a sub-channel transponder that allows him to communicate with people in the house. Direct communication lines are often monitored by spies, and the houses use lots of different means of communication to get messages to one another. Jessica even finds a leaf at one point covered in braille left by the previous occupants, and this is in order to warn her of a traitor. The families also developed battle language, and this was so they could communicate through sign language without alerting other figures to what they're saying. The Duke then signs the scroll with his house ring, which is something that grants power. Lynch's film, and the book especially, they make a big point of the baddies trying to get this ring. This means that they'll be able to sign orders, and in holding this, they'll be able to command the house to do things. It's not really brought in as much here as it is in those, and instead it kind of acts as a symbol of Paul following in his father's footsteps. But very, very important. Now from this point, we then meet Duncan Idaho, whose clothing of course resembles modern fighter pilots. His death is something that hangs over all the films, with Paul envisioning it happening before it then comes true. Paul says that he feels like in the dream if he'd been there, then Duncan wouldn't have died. However, we see that in him being there in the end, that's what causes Duncan to die. It highlights that Paul doesn't really interpret his visions exactly how they are, and we also notice some changes to what really goes down as to what happens in the dreams. Makes you question whether things are actually bound by fate or whether it's him doing choices that go towards them that ultimately leads to that happening. In the vision, we then catch a little beetle, which is something that Duncan also picks up before his death. But to Duncan, it's all a load of bloody mumbo jumbo, and he simply says,
"Dreams make good stories."
A huge shout out to Turner SC on Reddit, who broke down exactly what this could mean. They stated that Paul's visions just show possible outcomes, and the closer he gets, the more that he can change things.
But everything important happens when we're awake, because that's when we make things happen.
Dreams can help you get a glimpse into the future, but it's only when you're awake that you're able to change them. Paul sees dreams of himself dying in the story as well, but his death simply makes him awaken as the Muad'Dib. Duncan then heads to Arrakis to integrate with the Fremen, and it's the first indicator that the Duke is going to broker peace rather than to conquer. This is hammered home further at the gravesite, in which he basically explains his plans.
But if we hold firm and tap the true power of Arrakis, we could be stronger than ever.
What does that mean? Mining spice, keeping the Fremen in their place? We'd be no better than Harkonnens.
No. By making an alliance with the Fremen. That's what I've sent Duncan Idaho to arrange. Here on Caladan, we've ruled by air power and sea power. On Arrakis, we need to cultivate desert power.
Something later realizes he was right about when Duncan returns from the desert, and it's in this he realizes they might have a fighting chance.
Desert power.
This then plays off at the end of the movie, with Paul finally realizing he's able to attain that.
Desert power.
That will mean they have complete control of all the necessary resources and truly be the most powerful house in the universe. Paul then wrestles back and forth over whether he's the future though, and the Duke ends up showing him his ring. Later when the Duke dies, Paul ends up wearing this, and it shows how he's stepping closer towards his destiny. It of course plays a big part in the second film as well, but Paul kinda steps away from what his father wanted. Now from here, we then meet Gurney Halleck, with Paul mentioning how he recognizes his stride.
I can tell it was you by your footsteps, Gurney Halleck.
This is something that he also touches upon later when Gurney rescues him out in the desert.
I recognize your footsteps, old man.
Paul just can't be bothered to fight though, as he's had a very busy day, but Gurney still strikes. This shows that Paul's been trained to be ready his entire life, and ultimately, this is why he survives.
I guess I'm not in the mood today.
Mood? What's mood to do with it?
Arrakis is a harsh and unforgiving landscape, and he has to have it beaten into him that he must be on guard at all times to stay alive. Now at this point we also get a demonstration of the shields, which in David Lynch's version were these big blocky things, but not here, because that effect looked terrible. Here though, they're completely transparent except for when they get struck by a weapon. The way they work is that if something strikes fast, then the shield is capable of blocking it. This is why guns are completely useless, because all it's going to do is just get blocked by the shield. Whenever we see missiles or even the hunter seekers later on, you will notice they slow down right before hitting their target. With a blade though, you can strike slower, and this is why we see them go through the shield. This is also signified by turning red, and as we know, red means dead. Now this style was developed by Roger Ewan, who based it on Filipino martial arts. This is refined and almost like a dance, whereas the Harkonnens are far more brutal. Their fighting style was based more around Mongolian ones, and it culturally showed the difference between the two. Gurney then talks about how brutal the Harkonnens are, and he knows this for a fact because he actually comes from Giedi Prime. When he lived there, his sister was caught and used in one of the military pleasure houses before she was eventually killed. Gurney was also tossed to the slave pits, and the Beast Raban is the one who gave him his scar. However, the Duke was the one who saved him, and since then he's been indebted to the house. And from here, we then cut to Giedi Prime itself and see as Raban arrives to meet his uncle. Shot to resemble Colonel Kurtz from Apocalypse Now, we see as he rubs his hand over his head, much like that character. He later has a similar head in the pool shot to Willard, and the Ornithopter shots are a lot like the shots of the Hueys flying in that movie. The Baron basically reeks of wealth and gluttony, and he's a beast to the point he actually has to use anti-gravity tech to move around. Villeneuve said he saw the Baron as a human in rhino form, and this could be building off the bull metaphor we mentioned earlier. Now at this point, the Bene Gesserit then go to Caladan. We can see a gigantic planet behind them, and then we cut to a shot of the Highliner. Can't see the planet through the back of it, but you might notice that this looks slightly warped and stretched. This is to represent the folding of space, and it's how they're able to travel vast distances. Also love the shot as the ship comes down through the trees, and it reminds me a lot of the spaceships in E.T. Cutting across to Paul once more, we then see him lying in his bed with his shot echoing the one from the beginning. This is basically the point at which the book begins at, with him describing an old crone coming to visit him. Paul pretends to be asleep, and the mother remarks how he's very small for his size. This plays into his nickname the Muad'Dib, in which the character later down the line is named after a desert mouse. Taking him out to the Gom Jabbar test, you can see him already pulling at his collar. This is because of his foresight, in which he's sensing the needle that's about to be at his neck. Yue then talks to him in Mandarin, which at this point is an old language from Earth. The fact that Paul understands helps to show how well read he is and how he's been trained to converse with all walks of life. This ultimately helps him when it comes to his rule, as he can converse with every culture. Voice and communication are big parts of Dune, and tongues are actually the first thing that the Bene Gesserit learn. If they can master this, they can manipulate others and don't have a language barrier that stops them from interacting and understanding. This is how Jessica later traces the name Shadow Mapes and is able to talk to her and the Fremen. It's in this chapter that they even discuss his maternal grandfather and say that he cannot be named. This is a little clue that something's off with their lineage, and a slight hint that the Baron is his granddad. In the room, we then see the voice carried out by the Reverend Mother, which carries a lot of symbolism symbolism as well. Shows that the Benny are capable of controlling him, and that if they need him to, then he'll kneel before them. Kneeling, of course, means to be subjugated, and it lets us know instantly who's in charge. She also has a veil over her head, which symbolically highlights her secretive nature. It's only once Paul passes the test, they reveal who they are, and this shows he's entered the inner circle. We also see what those affected by the voice witness, with it pretty much becoming a blackout. Speaking of voices, Charlotte Rampling plays the Reverend Mother, and in real life, the actress is bilingual. She actually ended up dubbing herself in the French version, so if you swap the audio tracks out, you'll hear her there too. In the book, she talks about how Paul's mother was her serving wench, and in the expanded lore, we learn she's actually her mother. She also talks about the Gomenger bar and its poisons. She says that a duke's son will have to know them because they'll be in his food and drinks. Their cells will be able to fight and convert them though, and this will allow them to survive. But Paul's not that trained yet. This is her just trying to test Paul as much as possible though, because to her, he shouldn't have been born. Jessica having him has altered their plans, but she questions whether he could actually fit the role. This is why she later asks the Baron to spare him, because otherwise it'll throw away like millennia's worth of work. We then get what is probably the most famous quote in the book.
There's the white killer.
This comes directly from the text, along with the line about the box holding pain. Now at its most basic, this is the idea that when you're afraid, you don't think rationally. Fear can make you react without judging your surroundings and also cause you to go down the wrong path. The Emperor fears the Harkonnens and Atreides, and thus he puts in place a plan to destroy them. In the end though, this leads to his end, and had he not been afraid, then he likely still could have reigned. The test is to see if one can fight through fear and pain and keep their hand in the box. One must control their urges, and in doing so, they'll also conquer their mind. We also get shots of the future, including the sacred palm trees burning on Arrakis. These palm trees come to burn at the hour 24 mark, and it shows us how the prophecy was fulfilled. Paul also goes to touch the sand, showing that he's closer to his destiny. However, he's not quite touching it, and he must pass this test to go to that next step. It's important to bear in mind as well that when he goes to the planet, he doesn't actually touch it until the scene with the worm. Up until then, he'd been wearing shoes, but this physical touch provides a transformation. We also see a bloody hand gripping a blade, highlighting the bloodshed that will come at the hands of his rule. Paul then tells her of his dream of Chani, which is a section pulled right from the book. However, there they go beyond it. Paul says Chani calls him Usul in the dream, and that she asks about the waters of his home. He has to explain things like beaches and seagulls, and this is a scene that they adapt for part 2. The mother and Jessica also have a conversation in a soundproof room, and this is so that Paul can't listen in. The speech is pretty much the same as the one they have when she leaves the planet, and Jessica also promises to shield her son, but the mother warns her that if she shields him too much, then he won't grow strong. She also says that the Benny have been active on Arrakis and planted a prophecy to soften their arrival. Jessica then notices tears on the mother's cheeks as she leaves, which she thinks are more unnerving than anything she's said. For the film, Paul does overhear the conversation though, and she says,
"We have other prospects."
Now this subtly foreshadows Fade, who was also thought to be one as well. Count Fenring was one too, but all his scenes were cut from Dune Part 2. His wife Margot was also used as a way to collect Fade's seed, bear his child, and mean that there was another prospect on the board. The novel also tells us that though this plan's been put in place, the Emperor is actually really fond of the Duke. We discover that he was forbidden from having a son, and thus, when Leto came along, he just gravitated towards him. You might also notice that they're constantly walking around with these floating glow globes. These are machines, but that's as advanced as they can go, as technically if they went beyond that, they would be classed as thinking machines. In the book, we then learn that the Barons reached out to the Duke to end Canley. This is a vendetta between houses that's stretched back for centuries. The Duke refuses though, and signs the response Duke Leto of Arrakis, which the Baron and Peter love. That's because the Baron was actually hoping this would be the case, as it can be used as evidence to show he tried to broker peace. Obviously, he had no interest in doing that, and thus it means he can continue down this path. Peter also talks about how Jessica having a son has ruined their plans as well, but they don't really see Paul as an obstacle. The Baron just sees his family as being the ones who tamed Arrakis, so in his mind, Arrakis belongs to them. Really though, it just belongs to the Fremen, but even Paul comes in and rules them. This then sets them on a path for war, and it's a long time before they have peace. In the book, we then spend a week with the family on Caladan. We learn Paul doesn't have playmates as they could be used as weapons or spies to infiltrate the family. Paul also spends some time with Halleck, who talks about the thirst on Arrakis. He tells him a duke's son will never want for water, but Paul remembers a dream of thirst. It's in this that we also learn Paul's been trained as a mentat, and this is what aids him in seeing the future. Mentats are able to almost like work like an algorithm and see every path through cause and effect. So they can basically think through strategies and predict how things are going to go, which helps Paul see all outcomes. This is actually where the fight scene happens with Halleck as well, and just before it, Gurney also plays his balisette. This isn't completely missing from the movie. They do have it later, off to the side, which I will point out. And he does strum it later on in Dune Part 2. But throughout it, he just sings songs to basically boost morale, and this is something that the character does here. Jessica also moves things about as they're being packed up, and she uncovers the painting and also a bull's head. She wonders why she was drawn to these first and questions if there's any deeper meaning. Foreshadows the two forces that are about to clash, and it's such a foreboding moment in the book. Travelling into space, we then see their ships rise from the water, just like a baptism in which they go on to become something new. Paul touches the grass, similar to how he later touches the sand, and this symbolises his farewell and new beginnings. He also puts his hand into a pool of water, and it represents him being closer to the sand, but not quite touching it just yet. He then looks out onto the horizon, with the ocean going as far as the eye can see. On Arrakis, water represents wealth, and they're leaving all this behind to go somewhere where they'll have very little. Also, most of these scenes were shot in Norway, and it gives a great contrast from where they shot Arrakis. That was out in Jordan and Abu Dhabi, which gave them a big juxtaposition to everything we have here. The ships then travel to the planet, and we get a god saying, "Shield." This guy, they don't really bring much attention to him, but he was actually one of the gladiators that Fade fights in Part 2. Gurney then flicks to his orange Catholic Bible and says,
"My lungs taste the air of time blown past fallen sand."
Now, the Orange Catholic Bible is a text in the Duneverse that's an amalgamation of different religions, including Christianity and Islam. These influences are obviously rife throughout the film, with Paul being a Christ-like figure. The Fremen are obviously based around Islamic figures, especially due to the Lawrence of Arabia influence. Herbert admitted that was a story that majorly shaped his work, and a lot of figures in that are also similar to the characters we get here. So fusing these two together for the text also plays upon how Paul will join them later and fuse their cultures together. We also get a bagpipe player which is brought into the score, and Zimmer said that during lockdown his daughter used to kick off because he'd sometimes be recording this shit at 5 in the morning. And mate, I've walked down many a high street and heard that, and it can get a bit I'm sorry if you play the bagpipe, I'm very sorry. It's a great instrument, I love it, I love hearing it, play it all the time. But Hans Zimmer ended up looking at a lot of Middle Eastern music as well, and this was in order to craft a soundtrack that felt it was authentic. Mixing bagpipes with that just adds to the idea of cultural combinations and how all these different people are coming together on this planet. Apparently he spent weeks in the deserts of Utah as well, and that was in order to listen to the sound of the wilderness. This helped him to compose the melodies and how he felt like the piece should sound. Now Zimmer's of course worked a hell of a lot with Christopher Nolan, but he ended up actually turning down work on Tenet. This is because he was such a big fan of Dune that he felt like he couldn't turn this down, even if it was to work once more with the guy he'd made some absolute bangers with. And I will die on that hill, that the bit in Interstellar where they're spinning around, he transcended into godhood. Break down on the channel now, and that scene is a fucking banger. Anyway, we then see the crowd that's gathered to see Paul. Among these is Liet Kynes, who we see in a quick close-up. She works for the Emperor, but is also loyal to the Fremen, and her father pioneered relationships with their people under orders from the Big Bad. In the book, the character's a man, and actually the father of Chani, which is something that they don't bring to the film. However, we quickly realise how much the people have been manipulated by the religion, and this is to the point they see him as the Messiah. But he's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy. But Herbert believed that religion flourished amongst the desperate because that was all they had. The people have been waiting for a saviour and will do the mental gymnastics to make Paul their chosen one.
They see you, they see the signs.
We see what they've been told to see.
We then get to see the ornithopters, which were designed to resemble dragonflies. Bugs and insects were looked at closely by the production team, and they wanted to take their designs and adapt them into this world. The Hogden helmets purposely appear bug-like, and there's also the insect-like hunter-seekers. Now in nature, dragonflies are brilliant at flight because their wings allow them to instantly switch between flight modes. They can move quickly to lift and change to hover, with them also being able to maneuver quickly if one moves faster than the other. The wings on the craft can also hover as well. One can move fast, one can move slow, speed up, spin around, and it just makes the ornithopter a great all-round craft. Beyond that, Ornis means bird in Greek, and it again carries on the idea of the Atreides lineage. We then see them travel to the palace, which is of course based off pyramid designs. This is hidden amongst rocky and mountainous terrain, and this is so the sandworms can't swim under and reach it. This is also why Paul uses the atomics in part 2, as it destroys part of the mountain and allows the worms to come in. Looking at the planet's many moons as well, we can also see there's the distinctive Hand of God. Beside it is also the Muad'Dib, which is of course the moniker Paul later adopts. The Hand of God being next to the Muad'Dib could also symbolically show the plan that's there for Paul. The Muad'Dib is said to lead the way, and it guides the path with a divine hand. In reality, this is, simply just a canyon pattern, with them referencing the one on Mars to create its look. However, people believe this, and thus will do the mental gymnastics to make Paul the Messiah. But he's not the Messiah. You get the joke with that. Anyway, at the 55-minute mark, Duncan gives Paul a compass because the moon affects the poles and would send a normal needle off course.
The moons here have a magnetic field, so a simple compass needle won't point north. Takes a clever piece of clockwork to sort it out.
This highlights, though, that he's gonna act as a guide, which we'll talk about later in the video. The Muad'Dib then makes another appearance in the following scene when we see a hologram of one inside a bush. This then foreshadows their encounter in the desert, and yeah, it's just a nice little thing to lay the groundwork for that. Now we then cut to Jessica picking a housekeeper.
What is your name?
Shadow Mapes, my lady.
Shadow. It's an old Jacobs, or what? Well, Dipper? Is she Fleming?
This is again Jessica's knowledge of tongue, and she traces the name to seem like she might be an ally. The book talks about how Jessica instantly gets a read on the servants and then analyzes them all.
I know that you have a weapon concealed in your bodies.
I think she picks Mapes because she's a bit of a badass and could handle herself if things go down. Doesn't happen like that, and she almost gets killed straight away and then actually gets killed, but still, she's just thinking of the bigger picture. Now, Mapes had actually gone there to see if the prophecies were true and if the family were the ones that she'd been told about in the legends. Jessica, of course, knows it's been planted into the culture, but it makes her realize that those devout to her will serve them greatly. This is something that she weaponizes in part 2, and it's just nice to see the seeds of it laid here. Mapes is also overcome with crying religiously, and it shows how much she believes that the prophecies come true. She also tells her it's the
Tooth of Shai-Hulud.
And Shai-Hulud is the religious name for the worm, which the Fremen see as being godlike. These crysknives are also religious weapons too, and because of that, they come with some rules. Every time you draw one, you must always draw blood, and in the book, Mapes cuts her hand before putting it back. Jessica then notices that they have ultra-fast coagulation, and this is what's helped them survive in the desert. The chapter then closes out with her going to move the bull's head, and initially she thinks the horns have mud on them, but quickly realizes that it's blood. This again is another omen, and one that spells doom for the family. It's the blood of Paul's grandfather Paulus, and she's drawn to it because of what's coming with the Harkonnens. Playing upon the idea of religion being embodied by the Fremen, we then cut to a group of pilgrims. One's reading the orange Catholic Bible, and then kneeling before the tree in the courtyard. Each string the equivalent of 5 men a day, and it showcases how much tradition can often leave others struggling. I don't know if that's a comment on royalty or just worshipping in general, but Paul's ambition ultimately makes others suffer. We then see the gigantic sandworm mural and also some trout carvings behind Paul. In the book it said the Harkonnens actually designed his room so it would appeal specifically to him. I'm guessing he's homesick, and seeing the fish would make him think of Caladan. The assassin was then told to bunker down and basically cement themselves in. The place would then be checked over and over and over, and he'd have to be there a long time before anyone arrived. He'd then only get one chance, and it's at this point that the killer makes his move. The headboards are also mentioned as something that needs to be reinforced, and this is so assassins can't strike, and it's why the HK must burn its way through. Due to the technological restrictions as well, the Hunter Seeker has very basic functionality, and it simply scans and moves towards movement. So Paul remains completely still. This is once again him showing his mind state with a Gom Jabbar, in which he's able to think and not panic. This is also needed across the surface of Arrakis, as one must move without rhythm to not alert the worms. Sound like Fatboy Slim there, but it's kind of like how if you're in the ocean, they tell you not to flap about. If you do, sharks and predators might think that you're wounded, and thus they're more likely to investigate and probably kill you. So I've saved your life there, and that deserves a thumbs up, I think. Mapes then enters and Paul takes it out, which is when they find the killer. Howard resigns, but the Duke denies it as he doesn't want any victor for the Harkonnens to come from this. In the book, he actually says his training's what saved Paul, as he knew how to act when the probe arrived. Now with the Baron, we see he's got a spider-like creature that we're told doesn't understand their language.
The thing must leave.
You can speak without fear. Our pet doesn't understand your language.
Get out!
The fact it responds to that, though, makes me think it was indeed listening in and just another sign of the Baron's duplicity. At least that's what Reader had on this watch through. Could also show the voice works on those that aren't even human. Now, you're probably asking, what the shit is this? Well, it looks like some weird genetic experiment. There are those in the Duneverse that experiment on life forms, and these are known as the Beni Talaxu. They create golas like Dune Messiah, with that being a clone of Duncan, Idaho. So maybe it's laying the groundwork for that. It actually helped to make Peter de Vries as well, so this could even be one of his pets. De Vries gets a lot more to do in the book, and he's desperate to take Jessica for his own ends. De Vries is a mentat who also came up with a plan to get Yue's wife, and this was in order to bring down the house. Yue is actually a Suk doctor who has specific conditioning, and this is supposed to mean he can't betray his house. This is demonstrated by the tattoo on his head, but obviously that doesn't happen. Vries figured out that if they held his wife, then this could be something that could get him to betray the family. The Baron also swears they won't hurt Paul or Jessica. The Bene have to be truthsayers as well, and this basically means that they're walking, talking lie detectors. So the Baron instead plans to feed them to the desert, as that way he technically won't have harmed them. We then cut to Paul going to the meeting, which is where Gurney says,
"They shall suck at the abundance of the seas."
This is actually a quote from Elder William Brewster, who was a leader of the Plymouth colony. He said this after thanking the lords for some clams during a famine, and it highlights how all they've been left with is scraps, which we next see with the silos. They're a far cry from the ones in the opening, and the equipment they've been left with is absolutely fucked. The Harkonnens took a lot of the good stuff with them, and they bring it back after the attack. Meeting Stilgar, we also get a reunion for Javier Bardem and Josh Brolin. Well, I say reunion, neither actor was actually on screen together in No Country for Old Men, but this does kind of make up for it. And there's breakdown on the channel now. Stilgar spits as a sign of respect, and this is because their entire culture is built around preserving moisture. In the book, they're the ones who also give them the still suits that they wear later on, along with the maps and spice liquor. It's through him that they also meet Leah Kynes, who, as we learn, is an envoy between the Fremen and the Emperor. Kynes is an ecologist who's following the footsteps of her father, and he had a dream of terraforming the planet to allow them to live on the surface without suits. Herbert was sort of one himself, and he actually put a lot of himself into Kynes. In case you don't know, Herbert was actually a reporter out in Oregon who was going over a story about ecologists working with the beach. The sands had been blowing up and destroying the farmlands, making it near impossible for food to be grown. Ecologists were then trying to introduce beach grass into the environment, which would slow this down and delay the effects. Ecologists were seen as people who could tame the desert, and though Kynes doesn't achieve that, the Atreides eventually will. He then ends up giving them their still suits, and is quite taken aback by how Paul naturally puts this on.
You've worn a still suit before?
No, this is my first time.
Your desert boots are fitted slip fashion at the ankles. Who taught you to do that?
Seemed the right way.
Now in the book, this is seen as being something that's further fulfilling the prophecy, but I did wonder if all them tapes you watched basically had him nailing how to do it. Like if you watch a YouTube video tutorial on how to put your shoes on, chances are you're gonna put them on okay. Oh, fuck! Out in the desert, we then get the rescue scene with the Harvester crew, which helps to give us a lot of different things. Firstly, the machines are lifted by balloons because if they made the entire journey on land, they'd simply attract the worms. Now, these machines themselves are called sand crawlers, and it really makes you wonder where George Lucas got the name from. It also shows that the Atreides aren't like the Harkonnens. Liet sees that they're kind and regards them as humans, however, the character also thinks that the desert isn't kind to them.
The desert isn't kind to equipment.
You know what will happen if I don't get spice production back on track?
The desert's not kind to humans either.
But because of this, they basically try and save the people, whereas the Harkonnens would have left them to die. They even talk about how the craft won't fit everyone on board, and think about how the Duke said to leave the spice. Even though to most, that would be worth more than the people. They throw stuff out on the sand and try and make as much room as possible, and the Duke even spots the worm first, which typically comes with a bonus. However, Leto asks this to be divided amongst the men, and he's clearly trying to curry favour. Beyond that, we also get Paul seeing a worm and encountering spice for the first time. The novel describes it as having the scent of cinnamon, and he describes it as tasting like that too. In the novel, Paul isn't caught up in the whirlpool, but the scene just works better for a movie, doesn't it? When designing the worms themselves, Villeneuve also spent a year concepting the creatures, and they dove into every single detail. Whether it was the texture of the skin or how it eats food, they really wanted the creatures to feel tangible and real. VFX supervisor Paul Amber studied the movement of whales and also their mouths, and basically brought these across to the creature. Whales actually have baleen filling to filter food, and this is why the creatures have those sharp teeth. When crafting the scene, they also had the sand mimic the movement of water, which gives the feeling of seeing a whale rise from the ocean. We see just how small the gigantic sandcrawler is in comparison, and the worm's so big you can't even fit it in the full frame. Obviously, a movie like this needs a lot of VFX, but the creative team did something that rarely happens when making these movies. Instead of using green screen, they actually used sand screen, and this was so the environment around the actors appeared more natural. The book also has a bit where two Fremen are revealed to have been observing them, and they manage to outwit the worm. Paul wonders how this happened, and it lays the groundwork for how he can survive in the desert. The Fremen simply show no fear in this moment, and it just gives a real mystique around them and how they're kind of these forces of the desert that we don't quite know yet. Now back in his room, we see Yue looking over Paul. In the book, Jessica senses that something's off with him because obviously he's plotting a betrayal. She even notices he says hearkening in a certain way and reads the venom in his voice. They then talk about his wife Wanna, and you want to know what he does? Well, Yue knows she's reading him, so he basically breaks down and starts crying, just to stop asking questions. He also wonders why he and Wanna never had any kids, and even ponders if he's part of some plan that was century in the makings. Paul then explains the vision of himself standing with a crysknife and his hand covered in blood, highlighting how he'll take Jamis' life. We also see Chani stabbing him as well, and it might make you wonder exactly what this means. This is symbolic of her giving him the crysknife though, and the stabbing itself is because he's killing his past self. Amongst this, he also sees Jessica pregnant and her giving birth to his little sister, who shall be known as an abomination. The movie then omits what's one of the big scenes in the book. That is the dinner scene in which several of the powerful people of Arrakis' industry are brought in to wine and dine with the family. Things begin with Paul observing the dinner's poison snooper, which he thinks says a lot about their society. To him, you can observe how advanced something is by how many people are trying to kill it. Just shows the constant danger there as well, and the planet's deadly not only for the worms, but also for the politics. They also have water that pours from a basin that people then wash with and then use towels to dry. The Duke then demands it be given to the beggars outside. However, he realizes the maid's annoyed because she was secretly selling the towels, and he thinks how much he needs to get used to the customs here. But it shows how arrogantly the Harkonnens would discard water, almost as if it was nothing. People having to drink drips from the towels is completely humiliating, and it's a sign of dominance from the family. They even have an airlocked room in the palace that's filled with water and plants, but no one really goes there. It just highlights the waste though, and how the wealthy use that for vanity while others die of thirst. At the dinner itself, we have a banker, water magnate, Kynes, a stillsuit designer, and also his daughter. Everything's played cordial on the surface, but they're all sniping back and forth and trying to get small victories on the other. It's not really a massive scene on the surface, but it just helps to capture the intricate webs of politics and ambition. You ask, who's really in control there? And there's a feeling of the upcoming betrayal laced throughout the conversation. Jessica reads each and every interaction, does her own thinking, and there's lots of back and forth. It's got very layered dialogue, and the Duke unfortunately also has to put down Jessica. He has to make her look bad, so to the others it looks like he suspects she's the traitor, and in death he leaves a message through Paul to remind her that he did really love her. It just speaks to the nuance that's in this story and is a great example of how politics and words are as dangerous as crysknives. Anyway, it's here that we then cut to Seleucus Secundus.
Suck on these nuts.
This is where the Emperor races his army, and they're the best of the best of the best, sir. This is an extremely unforgiving environment where people are basically forced through hardship to be you get it. But in the book, it's a reflection of Arrakis, as that's a place where only the strongest survive. Whereas Arrakis is dry and constantly beaten by the sun, these soldiers are constantly beaten by the rain. The Fremen also worship Paul, and this idea of belief pushing you through things is symbolized with the soldiers here. A priest-like figure stands at a sermon singing, much like one does with a hymn. We then see them getting anointed, and this is done by a priestess who places a bloody thumbprint on their head. This is similar to what priests and vicars do for a blessing, and it highlights how the Emperor is also seen as being godlike. You can also catch their wrists seem like rosary beads, and we get further religious imagery with where the blood comes from. This is drained from men who've been crucified upside down. We can also hear that distinctive throat singing, which is based on techniques from Mongolia and Tibet. They're then sent to storm Arrakis, which does differ slightly from the book, in that they're actually disguised as Harkonnen, as no one can know the Emperor was involved. We then see Jessica walking the halls crying. However, she composes herself in this moment and doesn't let the emotions get the best of her, which is demonstrating control over her mind. We then get a moment with her and Leto. This is fleshed out a bit more in the source material, and unfortunately, they don't really get much of a relationship in the movie.
I thought we'd have more time.
Here she asks if they'll protect her son, and in her mind, that must mean like turning him into the Messiah that destroys the universe. Yay! We then cut to the Matador and Bull statue, which is shown for the final time before the planet's attacked. Yue goes to Paul with a pill, and this is meant to knock him out so the Harkonnens can take him. Jessica and the Duke get one as well, but the Duke doesn't take it, and this is why he wakes up later. Yue then lowers the shield, and the Duke is sadly betrayed and captured. He actually awakens to see a light flashing in the desert, and this is signaling to commence the attack. The book says that the Atreides monitor all regular communication channels, so the Harkonnens are now doing things the old-fashioned way. This is when he finds Mapes being stabbed, and he's paralyzed by a dart, which we learn in the book has been set so the Duke can still speak, but Yue advises against it. Now Yue would feel bad, he would mate, but he sees him as being dead anyway for coming to Arrakis, and that he's just a tool he can use to get revenge on the Baron. In this moment, he then makes a deal with the Duke and says he'll save his son and wife if he helps to enact his plan. We also get an insight into his mind, and he realizes that history will remember him as a traitor. There's even like a poem in the book from the future that's like, Yue, 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 a million deaths were not enough for Yue. Which we get a bit behind that, it's a fucking banger. Yue, Yue, Yue. Oi, oi, oi. Now, we then watch as a soldier goes to a gurney, and you can catch the balisette down at the side of the bed. I told you I'd point it out. Missiles and bombs then light up the night, and in the book, this is where we get the artillery in the Day of Shields line that the Baron says in the second film. The book then adds an extra gut punch, as the thought is a chuckle in his mind. In the battle, we also see Gurney running head into it, and can catch Duncan Idaho clashing with the soldiers. They're dropped in almost like paratroopers, and both them and Duncan use anti-gravity tech much like the Baron. He then ends up stealing an ornithopter, and I love how he just kind of scares some soldiers away after killing a handful. Now, there was also a deleted scene during this moment that involved Jessica tied up on the floor. Though we don't know what was said in these scenes, we do have a kind of idea due to what happens in the book, in that Jessica wakes up bound and gagged, and she forces herself to remain calm. Peter and the Baron then enter, with a ladder saying that she shouldn't pretend to be asleep. It's a lot like when the Reverend Mother encountered Paul, but the Baron sees right through it. Turns out that they actually measured the ingredients in the sleeping pill, and this was to know exactly the moment she'd wake up. Baron then kind of gives Peter an offer he can't refuse. Throughout the book, Peter's desperately been seeking Jessica for his own ends, and the Baron kind of knows it. This is even more messed up when you learn the Baron's her dad, but obviously the pair don't really know. But the Baron offers Peter Jessica or a duchy of Arrakis. He knows him well and knows he wants power, and ultimately that's what Peter chooses. Now throughout, Peter and the Baron have been like, I don't know, constantly like thinking like, oh, I'm gonna kill him or he's gonna kill me, so I better kill him first. And Peter's obviously figured out that he's living on borrowed time. So power is just a thing he needs to survive, but ultimately this saves Jessica's life. And had Peter had Jessica at his side, taunting the Duke, then the Duke might not have set off the pill. She then realizes that the Emperor must be on it too if the Baron's gonna be using a truthsayer, which he does kind of divulge in this moment. At this point, Lady Jessica and Paul are taken to the desert where they're gonna be left to die. The deaf guy is pulled right out of the book, and we know from that the character's called Kinet. Jessica also thinks about how the gods themselves don't even realize they'll be killed as soon as they report success because the Baron won't want any witnesses. This is why upon landing, they then cripple the ship as basically they wanted the gang to all die in the desert. One of the other gods is called Seago, and they bring a lot of the talking points into the scene. The book also talks about the green light coming from the instrument panel, and I love how that's how Danny lights the scene. You might also be wondering how they got their suits, but there's a little clue given to us in the ornithopter. Jessica spots a hole that has a little diamond etched into it, which is a symbol of Dr. Yue. Underneath it is a little kit which has a tent in it, and also equipment which they use later on. We also get a piece of paper with a symbol on it, which the characters later unroll in the tent. I think in his mind, he's still keeping his oath and technically didn't kill the Duke himself. Jessica then shows how her mouth's a weapon as she not only bites one of the gods but also uses the voice. Upon landing in the book, Paul then kills the other soldier by kicking him, and Jessica sees his blood and thinks it's a waste of moisture. This shows how she's finally becoming assimilated to the planet. She then notices a ship coming in and thinks about how the Harkonnens have sent a clean-up team to kill their captors. Her final words in the chapter are run, and it's one of those things that, I don't know, when I was reading it I was like, well, I don't care if it's 1 AM, I'm staying up to finish the next chapter. Now in the book, this is actually Duncan, whereas for the movie, he doesn't reunite with them just yet. He instead flies out to Kynes and demands she tells the houses about the betrayal.
I am commanded to say nothing.
Paul and Jessica here have to survive the night as well, and they look back and forth between the desert and their home. At this point, the Baron then meets with the Duke, and Leto ends up staring at a bull's head. This is just like what his father saw before he faced death, and he went out fighting like the Duke does here. In the book, the soldiers also call the Duke the Red Duke, and it's in this he realizes that the Emperor's behind it. He's the only person that has ever called him that, and it removes all doubt in his mind. The Baron also calls him cousin.
You have a wonderful kitchen, cousin.
I can handle this myself, cousin. I got this.
Now this is done for a number of reasons, and the family of course share familial roots through House Carino. The word cousin was also used by feudal lords to talk with other lords, and it's done as a way to address the heads of houses. After killing Yue, the Duke then gets the Baron to come in closer, which is when he bites down and releases the gas. Now the reason that this was chosen as a weapon is because gas is something that can infiltrate the shield. The book has the Baron being a bit more cautious, as when Yue dies he actually utters the words, "You think?" So the Baron is like, what the fuck did he mean? And he's very slow to approach the Duke. It's actually Peter who leans in close, and the Duke's so dazed he can't tell it's him and not the Baron. So that's why the Baron escapes in the book, whereas yeah, he's actually pretty close. It's messed up as well, because in the book, the Baron thinks about how he was going to get rid of Peter, but the Duke actually saved him the job. For the film, the Baron also tells the Duke that Paul and Jessica are dead, which is actually a big change from the text. There he learns that Paul and Jessica escaped, which makes the character livid. However, it's a small comfort for the Duke, which is something he doesn't get in the movie. Still, it had been good much of his life. He found himself remembering an antenna chiton dangling in the shell blue sky of Caladan, and Paul laughing with the joy of the sight of it. And he remembered sunrise here on Arrakis, coloured strata of the shield wall, mellowed by a dust haze. Those are the things he thinks about as the character passes away, and it's just a nice way to hold on to the happy memories. The Duke's ring's also missing as well, which is what's truly needed to claim the house. At this moment, Paul and Jessica discover it in the tent, which Yue left them as a gift to show the Duke was dead. This is what gives Paul power going forward though, and he uses this ring as a symbol of following in his father's footsteps. In the legends, it was also said a meteor streak happened across the skies of Caladan, and it symbolized a great loss in the Duneverse. But yeah, this is the final gift from his dad, and now Paul must step up and take over the lead of the house. We then cut from Paul's hand to his father's, and lastly the bull looking down on them. After this moment, Paul has a vision of the future in which he leads an unholy war across the universe. We can see here that he's mastered the sandworms, and a similar shot's used in part 2 with Chani. This further highlights that his visions aren't always correct, and that he could easily be following one down the wrong path. After witnessing a bloody hand once more, he then sees a journey back to Caladan, where we can see him joined by Chani and Jamis. This again shows how the future could be changed, with it suggesting that Paul may still have control of it. We also catch Paul's eyes glowing blue, with the effect of these being done with VFX. Initially, they did want to use contact lenses to provide the blue, but quickly realized how much trouble that would be. The desert, of course, just keeps kicking up sand, and if you've ever wore contact lenses and you get something caught behind it, you'll know it's an absolute nightmare. So CGI it was.
A war in my name!
Everyone's shouting my name!
The film then has the Harkonnens coming to clear the room, which is when the Baron's discovered. In the book, the Sardaukar arrive to inspect the Duke, and the Baron lies and says he was the one responsible. He doesn't want the Emperor to know he slipped up, as he'll simply see it as a sign of weakness. The Baron then asks for a young boy who looks like Paul to be sent to his bedroom, which is such a messed up part of the story.
I'm getting the word nonce.
Yeah, in the novel, he's actually into young boys, but they obviously dropped this all from the movie. Paul then finds the Duke's ring, and in the book, he says he realizes that he's now the Duke. Hiding like a child when I'm now the Duke, Paul thought. He felt the thought gall him, but could not deny the wisdom in what they did. Something had happened to his awareness this night. He saw with sharpened clarity every circumstance and occurrence around him. He felt unable to stop the inflow of data or the cold precision with which each new item was added to his knowledge, and the computation was centered in his awareness. It was meant at power and more. Paul then figures out that the Duke has died, but says he just feels nothing. It's another fact amongst all the other facts. Now, he's simply reading and processing information, much like a mentat. Paul then tells Jessica at this point that the Duke is dead and says he doesn't now because if he says it later, it will just slow her down. He says it's the most logical thing to do and is actually a bit shocked by how emotionless he is. Jessica also deals with it in a way that all of the Benny do, and though there's a feeling of loss, she just doesn't show it. She also thinks about how if she had a daughter, it wouldn't have changed things and that the Duke still would have been killed. So having a son was actually out of instinct, and ultimately this saves the family. Speaking of family, it's here Paul tells her they're Harkonnens, and they obviously end up embracing that side by becoming ruthless. He finds it ironic that all their life they were trying to hate them, but now realizes that they're actually one and the same. He then thinks about the future and how he'll say hello grandfather before confronting the Baron, but in the future this is actually something that happens with Alia. They then think about their options, and Paul contemplates joining the guild as he knows that he'd have a place there and that they'd welcome his abilities. However, he says he doesn't know if he can live in a strange world of multiple futures, even though that is eventually what he ends up doing. They also touch upon something that they drop out of the movie, and to be honest, Herbert kind of drops it from his later work. But here they say that if you stop taking spice, you die. Those that come to Arrakis must stay on the planet, and even if they leave, they'll always have to take a piece of it with them. That then takes us into book 2, which is titled Muad'Dib. Now, Darth Maze on Reddit actually caught some amazing symbolism in this moment as we get a close-up of the water tubes on the tent. This looks like veins and blood, making this tent almost appear womb-like. Paul then emerges, almost like he's reborn, and the first thing he sees is a Muad'Dib, which symbolizes the path that the rest of his life will take. The little mouse is perfectly evolved to be something that survives in this harsh desert landscape, and it's the ultimate symbol of endurance. This is something Paul will also come to represent, and it's at this point they're rescued by Duncan and Dr. Kynes. They then travel to a Fremen outpost, and this was meant to change the planet to a lush paradise. This was later abandoned, however, it might be something that pops up in the future. Duncan, however, pays attention to the plants, which is something that kind of pays off down the line. Now at this point in the book, we actually get a chapter from Howard's point of view after the attack. He believes that Jessica was the traitor and sees he's hooked up with some Fremen. Howard's trying to tend to the wounded, but the Fremen say they should just leave them all to die. It's only once Howard says they have a water debt that things change, as they value that above everything else. The chapter then ends with the Sardaukar arriving, and this is when Howard's captured. It's not really one of the things that you need in the story, so I can totally see why they skipped it. Duncan also leaves a shield trap in the desert for the baddies, which they end up shooting. This sets off an atomic explosion, and it just cements the fact that the shields are unusable in this war. Also, I am kind of skipping over a line here in which Paul suggests proposing to the Emperor's daughter. This obviously comes to pass in part 2, and it's what he does in order to avoid chaos. Either way, the Duncan dies here after the Sardaukar arrive in what's a really cool moment. I just love seeing them float down silently, but the Fremen are waiting here with an ambush. This highlights how they can stand against them, but they don't quite have the leader who will inspire them to do it. Also liked how Duncan gets stabbed, seems to die, and then rises again, which could symbolically be setting up how he'll rise again in hate. Just in general, Duncan Idaho clones litter the timeline, and him and his magic penis pop up forever and ever and ever.
You mean astounding? Yeah, you do.
Racing outside, it's about buying Paul time, and we see his lights guide the way. We see a thumper being used by Dr. Kynes, and the sound of it is almost like a beating heart, with the worms being like blood that move through the veins of the planet. We then see Kynes readying her hook, but unfortunately she never gets to ride it. As we see at the end though, there are worm riders out there, and this becomes something much bigger on part 2. I think they did this here though, just to kind of tease what would come, but they wanted to save the first major ride for the bits in part 2. I also love how as she gets stabbed, we can see water spurting out the suit instead of blood. This also drips into her hand as she lies on the ground, and it's such a cool way to change what we typically see. Beating the way for the worm, we then see as they're all engulfed, showing what the true power here is. This is also a major change from the book as well, as their Kynes is just kinda wandering the desert.
Is that a joke?
He sees visions of his father and thinks about the planet, and ultimately gets consumed in a spice mass. It's a nice chapter that gives us some of his thoughts about the planet, but ultimately, with his death, it kind of goes nowhere. I think it's a lot like how it's before that, in that you can just totally skip it and nothing will be lost from the story. However, Kynes here manages to buy them time, and yeah, for me that just is a better way to serve the character. Now, Paul and Jessica then escape into the storm, which is another big part of the book. In it, Jessica's frightened but exhilarated, and she knows it all comes down to Paul's training. We also see how good of a pilot he is in this moment. Noticing the flares of the missiles, he heads into the storm to throw them off their tracking. The sand then beats at the ship, and the book tells us the storms here can eat through metal. Jessica then utters, "Fear is the mind killer," and she also hears Paul reciting it as well. In the film, Paul then has a vision, and after a lesson from Jamis, Paul learns to let go.
We must move with the flow of the process. We must join it.
This is similar to the section in chapter 3 where it talks about how the willow must submit to the wind. In many ways, this sums up Paul's arc, as he has to join the Fremen of the desert to come out on top. At this point in both the book and film, we then cut to the Baron healing. The novel tells us that he actually removed all the chairs from all the rooms he was in, and this is because it would force people to stand. In the book, he's also told the pair have to be dead after the storm, and kind of believes it's finally over. He then thinks about the path in front of him and swears that one day a Harkonnen will sit on the throne. In many ways, the character is right, and Paul will of course ascend to the position. He then talks about how much he spent, and the book tells us the guild charge a shitload for military transport. It'll apparently take 60 years to pay off, and that will be if they squeeze Arrakis for every single penny. In the film, he then orders his command to
kill them all,
which again takes us back to those Colonel Kurtz similarities. In that film, Will had ended up coming across his notes, and scribbled on them it said exterminate them all. We then get a shot of this sand coloured liquid that's then filled with these black oily spots. This symbolically shows the Harkonnens are consuming the desert, and it's such a cool shot. Now in the book they estimate there's 5 million Fremen on Arrakis, but Fade says that the count sounds a little low. It's actually also the character's 17th birthday at this point, and we get a discussion of the gladiator match that we see in part 2. He's on to killing his 1000th gladiator, and it speaks to the cruelty and bloodshed his reign will bring. The Baron also plans to plant Raban as the duchy, and then Fade will be brought in, and the people will cheer their rescuer, as he won't be as cruel as the beast. He also thinks about how Fade is a lovely, lovely boy with a lovely body, and
I'm getting the word nonce.
With Paul and Jessica, we then see as they crash and head to some rocks. Jessica puts on the still suit for the first time, and in the book she tastes the bitter fluid that comes from it. We then get a vision of Duncan on the rocks, and also one with Chani. In the book, with Kynes being her father, the pair share some commonality. Both have lost their dads, and this is something they bond over later. In the vision, she takes him to some Muad'Dib, who we see snuggled in some webbing. I did wonder if this was foreshadowing their bond in the tent and stuff, and how the pair will rely on each other in order to survive in the desert. Spotting a sietch, they then decide to cross the desert, with the book describing their agony as they walk across the sand. The way they use their muscles, can't walk without rhythm, that puts more pressure on their body, but it's the only way to survive. Jessica really struggles with doing in the film though, whereas we see Paul seems much more like a natural. They then sit and rest, but it's at this point they come face to face with a worm. In the book, Paul calls the worms their friends as they'll destroy evidence of their crashed ship. They really take time to watch how they move throughout the dunes, and the worm itself here is said to be bigger than a guild ship.
He's from sand.
Now in the novel, this is the term given to hard sand. You might remember back in the day, Neil deGrasse Tyson, he did like a big tweet about how sand doesn't make a noise. And everyone was like, well, mate, if we're starting off what's accurate in this, I don't know if we're starting at the sand. In the book though, Herbert obviously was aware of that, and he did specify that there was stuff known as drum sand. It's like a thing in the book, they explain it, Neil. Paul then ends up panicking and they run, which shows that he truly hasn't mastered everything. In the book, we actually get some great insight into their thoughts in this moment, and they're kind of relieved as being to run basically relieves their muscles from all that walking without rhythm. They then end up making it to the rock, and the worm pauses almost like a sign of respect. Kinda strikes me as being like Paul staring into the abyss, and in that, realizing what his future is. The mouth then beats away like a heart, again tying back to this idea of a thumper. Saved by the Fremen, they're then swarmed by the group as they make it to the rocks. In the book, Paul watches a mouse get picked off by a bird, and this acts as a metaphor for what could happen. Stilgar then appears and tells them not to run, as doing that will waste their water. The standoff is very tense, and in the book, Jessica realizes that they're just referring to her as the woman, so they've probably made their minds up. She knows she could use the voice in this moment to convince them, but it could also backfire, and the others could then swarm them. They even constantly talk about killing Jessica, and this is until she proves herself as a weirding woman. She does this in the book after pretending to faint and then besting Stilgar when he goes to grab her. In Fremen culture, the leader of the group is seen as the strongest, and one must beat them in combat in order to become the leader, which kinda lays the groundwork for a big scene in part 2. Paul in this moment also makes it to a rock with a gun where he plans to shoot down upon the group. But he's caught by Chani, and he thinks about how this face is from a dream, but in a meeting that he never foresaw. Janice wants them dead though, and he invokes the Antal challenge, with Paul taking Jessica's place in the duel. Jessica even wants to give the tribe their water as a sign of goodwill, but Jamis, being the dickhead he is, still wants to go ahead. Now Jamis, the reason that he's such a dick is because he wants to see if the prophecy is true. He basically assumes that Paul and Jessica are spoiled rich chumps and sees both as being easy wins. Little does he know though, the kid's been trained by the best of the best of the best, sir, and therefore he makes mincemeat of Jamis.
Jamis, don't do this.
Stilgar is clearly pissed off at him, and in the book he even says if Jamis wins, he'll also have to face him for his disobedience. Chani then gives Paul a crysknife, and we see that this also has a diamond on it, again playing into the idea that this is the way towards something helpful. Kind of like an omen. The book also tells us that once someone's seen a crysknife, they can't leave the planet without the Fremen's permission. Paul then ends up besting Jamis pretty easily, and we see he puts a blade to his neck. This is in order to get him to yield, but it's also something that Gurney Halleck taught him to do. Calling back to their battle in the beginning, this was also a move he pulled out to try and end the fight. In both it failed, and it leads to Paul killing him in order to take the next path. In the book, Paul thinks about how a frightened man fights himself, and this move basically makes Jamis unable to regain composure. He then gets a vision of his bloody hand once more, showcasing that this is a path towards genocide. The book then has the fight go on a little bit longer, and Paul has sort of a struggle with the battle. You see, fighting without shields is completely different to fighting with them, as normally you slow down before striking to break through that barrier. Here though, you just go straight ahead with the blade, and he has to adapt to Jamis not slowing down. Upon killing him, there's also a feeling of regret, and we watch as Jamis is wrapped up in his shroud. People then put their hands on his shoulders, and we get a long walk that symbolically shows him continuing on this religious path. But with him, he's accepted into the tribe, and finally he gets a hold of that
desert power.
This brings things full circle from the beginning, and we now see Paul heading towards the worm instead of running away from it. This will be the weapon that helps him win the war, and he'll become a rider, a mentat, and also someone like the Spacing Guild who's able to fold time and space. He also knows the ways of the Bene Gesserit, has religion behind him, and in the end will become the supreme being.
This is only the beginning.
Anyway, that closes out Dune Part 1, and huge thank you for coming on this journey. Please drop a like on the video and also leave a comment with all your thoughts below, and yeah, let me know what your favourite parts of Dune are. Do you not like it? Were you watching a Dune video, a very long one as well, but tell me why you've sat this long. You glutton for punishment? Now if you want to be punished even more, then why not follow us on Instagram at Heavy Spoilers. There we drop lots of teasers towards what we're working on, what we've already published, some things that I've bought, some stuff I've collected. Some of the stuff behind me, that'll get its own post, and yeah, if you want to keep up to date with us, that's the best place to go. Did you know as well that members of the channel also get early access to videos like this every single week, and if you click the join button you get at least one breakdown a week before anyone else. Costs just 99 cents a month, so that's like 4 videos a month, like 25 cents a video a month. You're not gonna miss that, are you, mate? I hope not. I hope you're doing better than that. But yeah, if you want to donate to that and help videos like this get made, it would really mean a lot to me, and hopefully these videos also mean a lot to you. If not though, I won't hold it against you, mate. You put your money away, enjoy the rest of your week, and thank you so much again for watching through the video. As always, I've been your host Paul, you've been the best, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, peace.